Think about how easy it is for a modern infantry unit to talk. A squad leader presses a button and speaks. A platoon commander can call another position while bullets are still flying. A company can request artillery, warn a neighboring unit, report casualties, change direction, or ask for ammunition without physically sending a man across the battlefield. Now remove the handheld radio. No walkie-talkies. No headset connecting every small unit. No instant voice link between the men under fire and the commander trying to understand what is happening. Before portable tactical radios became common during the Second World War, armies still had to coordinate attacks, stop advances, call for support, warn of enemy movement, and somehow keep scattered units connected while shells, smoke, mud, buildings, and machine gun fire tore the battlefield apart. So how did they communicate? The answer was not one system. It was a fragile combination of field telephones, buried wires, runners, flags, whistles, bugles, flares, signal lamps, pigeons, written orders, prearranged plans, and men whose entire job was to carry information through places where information was constantly being destroyed. And that last part matters. Before portable radios, communication under fire was not simply slower, it was physical. A message had weight. It was written on paper, spoken into a telephone connected by copper wire, flashed by lamp, carried by a pigeon, or memorized by a runner who had to survive long enough to deliver it. If the wire was cut, the conversation ended. If the runner was killed, the order disappeared with him. If smoke concealed the flag, nobody saw it. If the flare was mistaken for another signal, the wrong unit might move. If headquarters did not know that communication had failed, commanders could continue making decisions based on a battlefield that no longer existed. That was the hidden problem of command before the walkie-talkie. The men at the front and the officers behind them did not share one continuous picture. They lived in separate pieces of the battle. And every communication system was an attempt to connect those pieces before the situation changed again. To understand how this worked, we need to begin with the simplest method of all, the human voice. For most of military history, small units communicated because soldiers remained physically close enough to hear one another. Officers shouted, sergeants repeated orders, men passed commands down a line. This worked surprisingly well as long as formations were compact and the battlefield was not too loud. Ancient and early modern armies were often organized in dense groups, partly because cohesion made control possible. A soldier could see his officer. He could hear a drum or a trumpet. He could watch the standard moving beside him. Orders did not need to travel through an electronic network because the men themselves were the network. But firearms changed the sound of war. Artillery, muskets, rifles, and eventually machine guns filled the battlefield with noise. Smoke obscured vision, and as weapons became more lethal, soldiers spread out. That created a basic contradiction. The farther apart men stood, the harder they were to kill with one shell or burst of fire. But the farther apart they stood, the harder they were to control. By the 19th century, armies had already developed a vocabulary of sound signals to compensate. Bugles, trumpets, drums, and whistles could transmit simple commands over distances greater than the human voice. Different calls could mean advance, halt, assemble, change formation, mount, dismount, or retreat. Cavalry units relied heavily on bugle calls. Infantry officers used whistles for short, tactical signals. The advantage was speed. One sound could reach many men at once. The disadvantage was complexity. A whistle blast could tell a platoon to move. It could not explain that an enemy machine gun position had appeared behind the second farmhouse, that the left flank was exposed, and that the unit needed to change direction while coordinating with another company. Sound worked best for instructions everyone already understood. That meant armies had to prepare before battle. A short signal only worked because the soldiers had been trained in advance to know what it meant. This is one of the central truths of pre-radio warfare. When communication during combat is weak, preparation before combat becomes more important. Orders become more detailed. Timetables matter more. Subordinates need to understand the mission before moving. Signals are agreed upon in advance. The Army stores information inside training because it may not be able to send that information later. Visual signals worked according to the same principle. Flags had been used for centuries to identify units and transmit commands. Signalmen could hold flags in different positions, wave them according to a code, or use semaphore systems to spell words. At greater distances, signal lamps could flash coded messages. During daylight, flags could be quick and effective if sender and receiver had a clear line of sight. At night, lamps could replace them. But battle rarely provided perfect visibility. Smoke, hills, buildings, forests, rain, and darkness blocked signals. A flagman had to expose himself where others could see him, which often meant the enemy could see him too. And visual signaling had another weakness. The enemy could watch. Codes concealed meaning, but the act of signaling revealed activity. A signal station placed on high ground for visibility could become an artillery target. A bright lamp at night could announce the position of a headquarters. For complex messages, armies increasingly relied on wire. The electric telegraph had already transformed long-distance military communication during the 19th century. By the First World War, the field telephone had become one of the most important pieces of equipment on the battlefield. The concept was simple. Connect two positions with wire, attach telephones, and officers who could not see one another could speak almost instantly. Compared with sending a runner, it seemed miraculous. A battalion headquarters could talk to brigade. Artillery observers could report where shells were falling. A forward position could warn that an enemy attack was beginning. A commander could request ammunition or reinforcements without sending a horse or man several miles. This was the closest thing the pre-portable radio battlefield had to an instant communications network. But the miracle had a weakness running through the mud: the wire. Every telephone depended on a physical line connecting it to somewhere else, and war was exceptionally good at destroying lines. Artillery shells cut them, vehicles crushed them, soldiers tripped over them, flooded trenches damaged connections, retreating troops abandoned them. Enemy patrols deliberately cut or tapped them. A telephone could work perfectly before a bombardment and be completely dead minutes after it began. This created one of the least glamorous and most dangerous jobs on the battlefield: the linemen. Signal troops laid wire as formations advanced. They ran cable through trenches, along roads, across fields, over trees, and sometimes beneath the ground. When shellfire broke a circuit, they had to find the break and repair it. Imagine what that meant during an attack. A headquarters suddenly loses contact with the front. Nobody knows whether the line has been cut 20 yards away or half a mile away. A signalman takes repair equipment and follows the wire. He leaves the relative. Protection of the dugout. He crawls or runs along exposed ground while artillery continues falling. Eventually he finds two torn ends. He reconnects them. The telephone comes alive. Then another shell cuts the line somewhere else. The process begins again. World War I armies laid enormous quantities of field wire because they knew much of it would be destroyed. Important connections could be duplicated so that one line might survive if another failed. In established trench systems, lines could be buried more deeply for protection, but burying cable required time and labor. An advancing attack had neither. The farther infantry moved from its starting trench, the farther it moved from reliable telephone communication. That was the great weakness. Wire worked best when the battlefield was static. Trench warfare allowed armies to construct dense networks connecting headquarters, artillery batteries, observation posts, command dugouts, and supply points. Once the infantry went over the top, that network began to stretch. Signalers could attempt to lay new wire behind the advance, but every yard was exposed to shell fire, men, vehicles, mud, and enemy action. If the advance moved quickly, headquarters might lose contact completely. And when the telephone failed, armies returned to something much older: the runner. A runner was exactly what the name suggests: a soldier assigned to carry messages between positions. Sometimes the message was written, sometimes it was memorized. Sometimes several runners were sent separately with the same order because commanders assumed one might not arrive. The runner required no battery. He needed no telephone cable. He could cross terrain where no communications network existed. He could explain a message, answer questions, and sometimes return with a reply. But he had one enormous weakness. He was a human being moving through a battlefield. A runner could be killed by artillery, machine gun fire, snipers, gas, or simple bad luck. He could become lost. He could reach the correct trench and discover that the unit had moved. He could be wounded and forget part of a verbal instruction. A written message could be destroyed or captured. And perhaps, most dangerously, headquarters often had no way to know whether he had arrived. Imagine a company commander sending a runner to battalion headquarters with a request for reinforcements. The man leaves. 20 minutes pass. Nothing happens. Did he arrive? Was the request rejected? Was a reply sent? Was headquarters itself hit? Did the messenger die 50 yards from the trench? The commander does not know. He can send another man. That man faces the same journey. Communication becomes a gamble measured in human bodies. This was not an emergency method used only when everything else failed. Runners were fundamental to First World War battlefield communication. The reason was simple. They were mobile in a way telephone wires were not. An army could bombard a communications network into silence, but as long as a man could still cross the ground, information could potentially move. Potentially. The Battle of the Meuse-Argonne in 1918 produced one of the most famous examples of what happened when nearly every communication method began failing at once. Elements of the American 77th Division advanced into the Argonne forest and became isolated in what became known as the Lost Battalion. German forces surrounded the position. Communication with American lines became extremely difficult. Runners faced enemy-held terrain, telephone. Contact could not be depended upon. Even the unit's exact situation was unclear to the artillery supporting it. Then came one of the strangest incidents of modern warfare. Carrier pigeons became part of the communications network. The U.S. Army Signal Corps had established a pigeon service during World War I. because pigeons solved a very specific problem. A homing pigeon did not need a telephone wire. It did not care whether a road was blocked. It could fly over trenches, shell holes, and enemy positions. A soldier wrote a short message, placed it in a small container attached to the bird, and released it. The pigeon attempted to return to its home loft. During the Lost Battalion crisis, the pigeon Cher Ami carried a message that helped communicate the isolated troops' position while friendly artillery was threatening them. The story became famous because it sounds absurd to modern ears. Men fighting with machine guns, grenades, chemical weapons, aircraft, and modern artillery depending on a bird to move critical information. But the pigeon was not primitive in the context of the problem. It was remarkably resistant to some of the things destroying other communication systems. Artillery could cut a wire, mud could stop a vehicle, machine gun fire could make a road impossible for a runner. A pigeon could simply fly above much of it. But pigeons had severe limitations. They were essentially one-way systems. They flew home. A headquarters could send birds forward with a unit, then that unit could release them with messages back to the loft. The bird could not be told to fly to any new destination the commander suddenly chose. Bad weather could interfere. Birds could be killed. Lofts had to move with the army. Messages had to be short. Still, when wire was broken and the ground route became impossible, a pigeon might be the only connection left. That tells us something important about communication before the walkie-talkie. It was built around redundancy. Commanders did not trust one method. They used wire when wire worked, runners when wire failed, flags or lamps when there was line of sight, pigeons when movement on the ground became too dangerous, flares and rockets for simple prearranged signals. No system was ideal. The objective was not perfection. The objective was to make sure that when one connection failed, another might survive. Flares were especially useful because they could be seen quickly across a broad area. Different colors or patterns carried agreed meanings. A flare might indicate that an objective had been captured. It might request artillery support. It might tell gunners to move a barrage. It might signal danger or call for reinforcement. The advantage was speed. A soldier could fire one in seconds. The disadvantage was information. A flare could communicate only what had been agreed upon beforehand. It could not explain why the situation had changed, and battlefield confusion created opportunities for disaster. Smoke might conceal the signal. Another formation might use something similar. The enemy could learn the meaning and imitate it. A soldier could fire the wrong cartridge. An observer could misidentify the color through haze. The same applied to whistles. A company commander could blow a whistle to start an assault. But once, several officers were using whistles within the same area. Who was signaling whom? An enemy whistle sounded like a friendly one. Shellfire could drown it out. Sound and light were best for local, simple, expected commands. The more information a commander needed to transmit, the more he depended on wire or a messenger. And World War I made information extraordinarily difficult to move. Consider what happened during a large infantry attack on the Western Front. Before the assault, the plan might be prepared in extraordinary detail. Artillery would bombard enemy positions. At a specific time, infantry companies would leave their trenches. A creeping barrage might advance according to a timetable. The infantry was expected to follow behind it. Different units had assigned objectives. Reserves were supposed to move after a planned interval. Runners knew where new command posts were expected to be established. Signalers prepared wire to carry forward. Flares had assigned meanings. On paper, the attack could look precise. Then it began. The first shell holes slowed one platoon. Machine gun fire stopped another. An officer was killed. Smoke concealed visual signals. A telephone line was cut. A runner disappeared. One company reached its objective early. Another never reached it. Headquarters continued following the timetable because nobody had yet reported what had happened. This was one of the central problems of the Western Front. The artillery could continue moving forward according to schedule while the infantry fell behind. A reserve unit could be ordered toward a position that had never actually been captured. A commander might believe a flank was secure because the last message said it was secure 40 minutes earlier. Information aged quickly. The battle changed faster than the communication system could describe it. This forced commanders to make decisions based on incomplete and delayed reports. It also forced junior officers to act independently. Once a platoon moved beyond reliable communication, its leader could not ask headquarters what to do every few minutes. He had his orders. He had the men around him. He had whatever he could see, and he had to decide. In that sense, the absence of portable radio-shaped leadership itself. A commander could issue detailed instructions before an attack. Once the attack began, control moved downward. The men closest to the fighting possessed the newest information precisely because they were there. Headquarters possessed more authority, but older information. That tension defined command before reliable mobile communication. Radio already existed during World War I. This is an important distinction. Armies did not enter the war completely without wireless communication. Radio was already extremely important for navies and increasingly useful at higher military levels. But early battlefield sets were not the small, reliable voice radios people imagine when they hear the word walkie-talkie. Many were large and heavy. Some required carts, batteries, generators, antennas, and teams of trained operators. Wireless telegraphy often meant sending coded Morse messages rather than simply talking. Signals could be intercepted, equipment could be fragile, transmitters could reveal the presence of headquarters. At the lower tactical level, field telephones, wire, visual signals, and runners remained indispensable. The idea of giving an infantry leader a portable voice radio that could move with his unit was still technologically difficult. And this is why the walkie-talkie represented something larger than a convenient new gadget. It changed where the communications network existed. A telephone was tied to a place. One end of the wire existed here, the other existed there. A runner physically carried information between the two. A portable radio allowed the connection itself to move with the soldier. But making that possible required several problems to be solved at once. The radio had to become small enough to carry. Its batteries had to be practical. It needed useful range. It had to survive mud, rain, shock, dust, cold, and rough handling. It needed to be simple enough for a soldier to operate under stress. And voice communication had to be clear enough that men could understand one another over battlefield noise. The interwar period brought major improvements in electronics. Vacuum tubes became more suitable for portable equipment. Frequency modulation technology offered important advantages for clear, tactical voice communication. Military laboratories experimented with radios designed specifically for mobile forces. Then the Second World War made the requirement urgent. This war moved. Tanks crossed large distances. Motorized columns advanced faster than signal troops could construct permanent networks. Aircraft cooperated with ground forces. Infantry landed on beaches and islands where no telephone system existed. Paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines with no wires connecting them to anyone. The static communications architecture of trench warfare was no longer enough. Armies needed communication that moved at the speed of the unit. The United States developed portable sets that became closely associated with this transformation. One of the most important was the SCR-300. It was a backpack FM radio designed for tactical voice communication and became widely known as a walkie-talkie. It was not a small plastic handheld device. The radio, batteries, antenna, and accessories created a substantial load carried on a soldier's back. But compared with earlier battlefield radios, it provided extraordinary mobility. A radio operator could move with an infantry unit and maintain voice communication over tactically useful distances. The smaller SCR-536, commonly associated with the name handy-talkie, brought the concept even closer to the handheld radio. It provided shorter range communication in a package one soldier could carry in the hand. These devices did not appear from nowhere. They were the result of decades of attempts to solve the same problem armies had faced with runners and wire. How do you make information move with the battle? Now imagine the difference from the perspective of a company commander. In 1918, one platoon disappears behind a ridge. The commander needs to know whether it has encountered the enemy. He sends a runner. The man crosses the ground. Perhaps he reaches the platoon in 15 minutes. Perhaps the platoon leader writes a response. Perhaps the runner returns 15 minutes later. Half an hour has passed. The situation described in the reply may already be obsolete. With a portable voice radio, the commander calls. If the platoon answers, the connection exists immediately. The leader can report enemy fire. The commander can change the plan. A neighboring unit can be warned. Information remains imperfect, but the delay has collapsed. That changes far more than convenience. It changes tactics. A formation can react faster. Artillery requests can move more quickly. Commanders can redirect units without physically locating them first. A unit separated by terrain does not automatically become separated from the chain of command. This was especially valuable in amphibious operations. An assault unit landing on a hostile beach could not wait for miles of telephone wire to be installed before establishing contact. During the fighting at Anzio in 1944, American forces relied heavily on radio during the initial stages because normal wire communications back through the beachhead could not simply be assumed. The SCR-300 proved particularly valuable as an infantry communication set. That represented a profound change from the Western Front only one generation earlier. But portable radios did not make field wire obsolete. World War II armies still laid enormous quantities of cable. There were good reasons. Wire could be reliable once established. It could carry conversations without continuously broadcasting radio energy into the air. Radio transmissions could be intercepted. Direction-finding equipment could help locate transmitters. Frequencies became crowded. Terrain interfered with signals. Batteries failed. Sets broke. So armies combined old and new methods. Wire for established headquarters and positions. Radio for mobile units. Runners when equipment failed. Visual signals for immediate local commands. Messengers for maps, written orders, and material that was too complicated or sensitive for an insecure channel. The portable radio did not replace the communications network. It added a new layer that remained useful when physical lines could not follow. And radio introduced its own human cost. Someone had to carry it. A World War II radio operator could become one of the most important men in a platoon or company. He also carried a heavy and conspicuous piece of equipment. The antenna could reveal his role. Batteries added. Weight. The operator had to remain near the commander who needed the set. If the commander moved into an exposed position, the radio operator followed. If the operator was killed or the set was destroyed, the unit could lose its primary communications link instantly. Portable radio also demanded a new kind of discipline. Speaking was easy. Speaking securely was not. Operators used call signs, code words, authentication procedures, and standardized radio language to reduce confusion and protect information. Messages needed to be brief. A unit that talked continuously occupied the frequency and increased the chance of interception. Names, positions, and intentions could not always be spoken openly. Radio solved the physical problem of carrying a human voice across the battlefield. It did not solve the military problem of deciding what information was safe to transmit, and the equipment could fail at exactly the wrong moment. Hills and buildings could block or weaken signals. Antennas could break, batteries could die, water could damage equipment. An operator could tune the wrong frequency. Enemy jamming could interfere. The radio might produce nothing but static when the commander needed it most. When that happened, the old methods returned. A runner still worked. A flare still worked. A whistle still worked at short range. A written order did not need a battery. This is why redundancy remained fundamental, even after the walkie-talkie arrived. Every method had a weakness. Wire was reliable, but could be cut. Radio was mobile, but could be intercepted or jammed. Runners were flexible, but slow and vulnerable. Flares were fast, but could carry only simple information. Pigeons were hard to electronically disrupt, but mostly one way. There was no perfect system. There was only a balance between speed, range, security, reliability, and mobility. The transformation becomes especially clear when comparing artillery communication between the two world wars. Artillery might be positioned miles behind the infantry. The gunners often could not see the target. Forward observers watched enemy positions and reported corrections. With telephone communication, this could work extremely well as long as the line remained intact. But if the wire was cut during a bombardment, the observer could become separated from the guns precisely when rapid corrections were most important. Portable radio allowed observers to move with forward units and continue sending information without a physical line connecting them to the battery. That reduced the time between seeing a target and putting useful fire onto it. The artillery piece did not become more powerful. Because of the radio, the entire artillery system became faster because the information connecting observer and gun could move. Armored warfare made the importance of mobile communications even clearer. A tank is a terrible environment for traditional signaling. The engine is loud, the crew is enclosed inside armor, visibility is limited, vehicles move quickly and create dust. Flags and hand signals are difficult to see once a formation spreads out or comes under fire. Without radio, a tank commander has a powerful machine but limited ability to coordinate with other machines once the battle becomes confused. By World War II, radio communication inside armored formations had become a major component of effective tank command in armies that used it well. One tank could warn another. A formation could change direction. Commanders could coordinate movement without stopping and sending a messenger. The tank did not become valuable only because of armor and a gun. Its ability to cooperate with other tanks mattered enormously. Communication helped turn individual vehicles into a formation. Infantry experienced the same transformation on foot. Before portable radio, communication generally required a path, the path of a wire, the path of a runner, the line of sight between signal flags, the flight back to a pigeon loft. Break the path, and the message stopped. A radio wave could cross a shell crater without laying wire through it. A river did not need to be crossed by a messenger before the voice arrived. A road blocked by wreckage did not automatically block communication. That was the revolution. But radio created an invisible path that could be attacked through interception and jamming. Every communications technology solves one vulnerability by creating another. And this is why the history of communication under fire is really a history of what armies were willing to risk in order to move information. With field telephones, they risked the wire. With radio, they risked secrecy. Before either was dependable, they often risked people. The runner is easy to overlook because he carried no famous weapon. He did not command a division. He did not operate a tank. He carried a message. But that message might contain the location of an enemy machine gun. It might be an order to withdraw. It might warn that ammunition was almost gone. It might tell artillery to stop firing because friendly troops had moved forward. The entire value of the information depended on one man reaching the right place. If he arrived, a company might survive. If he did not, headquarters might never know that a problem existed. The same was true of the signalman repairing telephone cable. His work was almost invisible when it succeeded. The telephone simply kept working. Only when the line went dead did everyone understand how much depended on him. This is one reason communication disappears from many popular accounts of battle. Maps show divisions and arrows. Histories describe attacks and counterattacks. Films show soldiers firing rifles and machine guns. But every arrow on a military map required information to move. Someone had to tell the unit where to go. Someone had to report whether it arrived. Someone had to request support. Someone had to warn the neighboring formation. Without communication, an army stopped being one organization and became separate groups fighting their own private battles. World War I demonstrated the consequences of that fragmentation on an enormous scale. World War II did not eliminate it, but portable radio helped close the distance between those separate worlds. And after the war, expectations changed permanently. Soldiers increasingly assumed that small units should be able to communicate while moving. Portable radios became lighter, batteries improved. Transistors eventually replaced bulky vacuum tube equipment. Networks extended farther down the chain of command. The radio moved from a specialized device carried by dedicated signal personnel towards something available much closer to the individual soldier. Today, military communications can connect infantry with vehicles, aircraft, artillery headquarters, digital maps, and data networks in ways a First World War signalman could barely imagine. But the old problem remains underneath everything. Communication can fail. Radios can be jammed, networks can be disrupted, satellites can be attacked, antennas can break, batteries can die, buildings and terrain can block signals, software can fail, and an enemy who understands how much an army depends on communication will attack the network itself. That makes the older methods more than historical curiosities. Modern soldiers still need plans that survive broken communications. Subordinates still need to understand the commander's intention. Visual signals still have value. Messengers can still move information. And sometimes the most important question is the same one a platoon leader faced a century ago. If I cannot reach headquarters, do I still know what I am supposed to do? That question reveals what the walkie-talkie really changed. It did not create military communication. Armies had always communicated. It changed the speed, mobility, and expectation of communication. Before portable radios, soldiers built networks from whatever could carry information. Copper wire, paper, light, sound, birds, human legs. They expected parts of that network to break and built backups around the assumption. A commander under fire might begin with a telephone. When shelling cut the wire, he sent a runner. If the route became impossible, he used a flare. If the unit was isolated, he released a pigeon. Each method carried only part of the burden. Together, they kept the army connected just enough to continue fighting. So the next time you see a World War II photograph of a soldier carrying a large radio on his back, remember what that weight replaced. It replaced miles of wire that did not have to be laid first. It replaced some of the delay of a runner crossing a field. It replaced the uncertainty of waiting for a written reply. It replaced part of the dependence on flags, lamps, whistles, and flares. Most importantly, it allowed a human voice to move with the battle. Before that, communication often stayed behind, and when infantry moved beyond it, command became slower, more local, and far more uncertain. That was communication before the walkie-talkie. Not silence, not chaos. A carefully layered system of wires, signals, messengers, and prearranged plans held together by people who knew that every connection might disappear without warning. And sometimes the most important man on the battlefield was not the one carrying a rifle toward the enemy. It was the one carrying a message through the fire. If this story changed the way you imagine warfare before modern technology, subscribe to Before Modern War. We examine how soldiers communicated, navigated, survived, and fought before electronic systems transformed the battlefield.